A possible ground operation in Lebanon, according to the chief of the Israeli army. Earlier, it said it's activating reserve troops because of rising tensions with Hezbollah. Ronnie Chattar is a Lebanese political analyst and told Iain Dale on LBC he doesn't think there'll be an all-out war in Lebanon.
I do not think the Lebanese state, as of now, will be a direct target. People are still flying in and out of the country. So in terms of infrastructure, that has not been targeted. There have been threats to evacuate the Ministry of Information. It hasn't been hit. I think there's a lot of psychological warfare that is not at the all-out war level.
It's been revealed 37 people released from prison early under the government's emergency scheme were freed by mistake. The Ministry of Justice says they were all logged under outdated legislation and all but 5 are now back behind bars. Following 2 years of industrial action, rail staff have backed pay offers from train operators and Network Rail. Members of the RMT unions have voted in favour of the deals. And a man who encouraged people to damage ULEZ cameras in London on social media has avoided jail. Joseph Nicholas, who also sent emails threatening the makers of the devices, got 2 suspended sentences. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed down 14 points at 82.68. The pound buys $1.33 and €1.20. LBC weather, a band of rain moving northwards into central areas tonight. Showers for the south and a low of -1. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
We're back in London for Cross Question. It's 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. On our panel tonight, we have the former Conservative Party Chairman and MP Greg Hands. We have Kezia Dugdale, Associate Director of the Centre for Public Policy. I nearly said Centre for Policy Studies then. That would have been a bit of a change, wouldn't it? Centre for Public Policy at the University of Glasgow, former leader of the Scottish Labour Party. Liam Halligan, economist and broadcaster who writes the weekly Economic Agenda column for the Sunday Telegraph. And Christina Patterson, journalist and broadcaster. They're here to answer your questions. 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp us on that number, or you can text 84850 and do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, our first caller is Jack in Dagenham. Jack, what's your question, please?
Hello, Iain. First of all, I want to make a throat clearing and say that because you're presenting the show, you're forgiven for not pulling people up on my question here. There have been several callers saying that Resolution 1701 has not been enforced, and indeed Israeli officials have said Resolution 1701 has not been enforced. If Israel can ignore countless UN resolutions, why can't Hezbollah ignore Resolution 1701?
Well, this Resolution 1701, that was passed in 2006, and it called for all fighting between Israel and Hezbollah to be stopped, with only Lebanese army and UN peacekeepers allowed in southern Lebanon. So that gives you a little bit of context for Jack's question. And it is true, as Jack says, that Israel has ignored countless UN resolutions. But you can't equate a sovereign state, a democratic state, with a terror organisation like Hezbollah. That's what I would say. Let's see what our panel says. Kezia, let's come to you first.
So I agree with that as a starting point. I also come to this as a citizen of very little knowledge, actually, when it comes to exactly what's happening in the Middle East, so I won't pretend to. My gut instinct is, as I watch what's unfolding amidst the absolute horror, is this sense that diplomacy is completely failing us in every sense here. And I worry deeply about the extent to which that this might escalate and the speed at which that escalation might take place. And I've got, a great deal of hope and expectation that something will come from the UN, but it doesn't feel likely right now.
Christina.
I mean, it's tragic, and it's impossible to see a solution because you have terrorists in Hamas, you have terrorists in Hezbollah, and you have an Israeli Prime Minister who seems set on preserving his skin above all else. And when I've fallen out with friends, I've lost a friendship over this. I'm sure many people have, not because I'm on one side or the other. I don't feel I am on one side or the other. I do believe in international law, and at the moment, everybody seems to be breaking it. After the 7th of October, it was clear that Hamas had launched an utterly barbaric attack and massacre and kidnapping in Israel, and Israel did have a right to respond, but Netanyahu is refusing all attempts by anyone to try to bring an end or a ceasefire. And I have to say that Biden doesn't seem very interested either. I think the US is just holding water. The one country that has the power to have some influence over Netanyahu isn't exerting it. So it is just heartbreaking.
Why do you think that is?
I think that they don't want to rock the boat before the election. And it is true that this does rock boats, but I mean, there is another issue, which is justice. And this is just serving nobody. And just to see what's happening in Lebanon at the moment, the innocent people who are being killed because Hezbollah are behaving totally unacceptably. I mean, what is so tragic is that the population of Lebanon, of Gaza, and to a certain extent of Israel are being, in a sense, held hostage by absolutely horrific men. And one might expect that of terrorists, but one should, in a democratic country, expect better. So it's just heartbreaking.
Liam?
Well, as we approach the anniversary of the 7th of October, the full horror of that incident comes into view. The death toll from that one incident is now 1,205. And we've got to get this in context, Iain. This is already the most serious situation in the Middle East since the Yom Kippur War in 1973, and we're now on the brink of a very, very serious escalation of where we are, given that Hezbollah and Israel are trading missile exchanges, with Iran-backed Hezbollah now targeting Tel Aviv. I think there's a lot of wisdom in what we've just heard. It does strike me that this is a moment for the international community to say, this now has to stop. We now need to get seriously engaged, not least the United States. And I agree, it seems to be largely because of the inconvenience of the electoral cycle that the US isn't getting involved. How serious does this have to be until we have this leads the news? Obviously, it's leading the news tonight because of the escalation of what's happening in Beirut. And by the way, there are thousands of British subjects in Beirut who are now being told to leave as soon as they
Well, we heard earlier there are 10,000 British people in Lebanon.
Indeed.
That's a very large number to try and evacuate in, say, a 24-hour period.
And my main message would be, when does the international community get really serious about this and call some kind of international summit to immediately take ownership of the situation to the extent we can? Look how divisive it is in our country and in many other countries in the US, across the world. This situation is obviously very deeply inflamed, but we're on the brink of it becoming even more serious.
Greg Hans, now I'm trying to remember, in amongst your many ministerial roles, whether you were a Foreign Office minister at any point.
I wasn't, no.
Okay. That couples that question then.
But I have been to Lebanon, and I do think the whole situation is an absolute tragedy for what is an amazing country, a beautiful country, which was one of the most successful countries, if not the most successful country in that region, until really the 1960s or 1970s, when it all sort of started going down when taken over by groups like Hezbollah. I mean, I think the one thing to mention is the role of Iran in all of this, which we haven't really discussed, which I think is a really malign influence in that region, where they basically support and give succor to terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and use these people to pursue their own foreign policy aims, which I think is a very bad influence on the whole region. But I think actually I agree with my fellow panelists. I think Israel, of course, has got the right to defend itself. There's no other country in the world that I think faces that kind of a situation where in a neighbouring country you have a group, a terrorist group, which is not only your enemy but pledged to basically liquidate you and your people. I mean, it's a unique situation that no other country I think really has to face. And I think whether Israel has complied with the terms of 1701, I'm not absolutely familiar with all the terms. I think you have to recognise that the situation is is different because of the way that Israel is placed in the world, with having groups that are committed to its destruction of the state and of the people who live there, which I think makes Israel a different kind of case for some of these things. I'm not trying to excuse Israel, but I do think you have to recognise the situation that it is in with both Hezbollah and Hamas and the role of Iran.
But it is a very different defence that Israel will put forward. If they say if they do launch a ground invasion, that is so different from being behind the blowing up of 4,000 terrorist pages. How are they going to convince the world that a ground invasion will actually enhance their aim of targeting Hezbollah terrorists? Because by definition, a ground invasion is not a targeted thing.
Well, I think if I remember correctly, back in 2006, I think Israel did not do very well in the sort of court of international opinion with its previous ground operation in Lebanon. So I would imagine, but I'm not expert in these matters, I would imagine that Israel would probably do it with some reluctance to actually launch a ground invasion. It may feel that they don't really have much choice in that situation. I'm not really a military analyst to be able to judge, whether their call has been correct. But I cannot imagine that they are entering into a ground invasion, if that's what it turns out to be, with a great deal of gusto and enthusiasm.
I read out the words of an IDF, I don't know what his position is, but he gave a talk to IDF troops basically saying, get ready to invade because that's what you're all here for. They've called up reserves today. But one of our callers earlier suggested, well, this could just be a giant bluff, that they're trying to sort of almost frighten Hezbollah into retreat, and they've got no intention of invading. Now, sitting here today, we can't know that. I mean, bluffing is part of warfare, I guess. It's an established military tactic.
I don't think Hezbollah will be that frightened. I mean, from what I understand, obviously I'm no expert, but from what I understand, Hezbollah are very well prepared. They've got tunnels. They can drive vehicles into those tunnels. The tunnels under Gaza are largely for storage. The tunnels under South Lebanon are for warfare. They're for military defence. And they know the territory, and they've been preparing for... They didn't do well last... they did well last time. I think Israel should be more worried about... I mean, obviously, the civilians in Lebanon would have every reason to be worried sick. And if Israel turns South Lebanon into another Gaza, it would be an absolute catastrophe. But I'm not sure that in military terms that Israel has an enormous advantage on the ground. It certainly does in terms of weapons, but on the ground, I'm not sure. But as I say, I'm no expert. But I think in terms of a global opinion, it would be absolutely disastrous. I can't imagine the IDF is terribly keen to fight wars on two fronts either.
Liam?
Can Netanyahu survive a ground invasion in terms of his own domestic politics? Opinion in Israel is obviously particularly split. And the other thing I'd say is, in terms of the international response and Israel's reputation across the world, if this Middle Eastern escalation in violence becomes even more serious, I don't think it's too cynical to point out that there will be economic impacts. There'll be impacts on commodity prices, on oil prices, as we go into the Northern Hemisphere's winter. That is not a factor that can be disregarded or unspoken, because it will exert a lot of political pressure on the various actors to try and limit the violence, because there will be economic fallout from that violence as the Western world's trying to escape inflation, trying to get interest rates down, trying to get the global economy moving.
Kezia, final word from you.
I think it's interesting to note that we don't hear nearly enough about what the citizens of Israel think about this. And I'm aware of hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets in protest at Netanyahu, yet somehow that doesn't feature prominently in how we talk about it here. And maybe that gives us just a little bit of hope.
I think I read over the weekend that actually, while opinion was very split on what Israel was doing in Gaza within Israel, on Hezbollah and Lebanon, that Israeli public opinion is more united in favour of this action. But feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, anybody on the text. Certainly read that over the weekend. Thank you very much, Jack, for your question. We'll come with more questions in just a moment. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Thanks to Patrick, who says, it's great to hear Iain Dale on the radio. I thought he'd left. Many people hope that, Patrick, but certainly not yet. Right, let's reintroduce our panel to you. We have Greg Hands, former Conservative Party chairman, Kezia Dugdale, Associate Director of the Centre for Public Policy at the University of Glasgow. I've got a printout here of a very august report you've just done on constitutional issues.
It's chunky, Iain.
Very chunky. Well, I've only got the executive summary, thank goodness. But I only say that just to provoke maybe a question on constitutional issues.
I'm well up for
What's
that.
its main conclusion?
Well, it codifies a route to a second independence referendum, which you might not expect me to advocate, but there's a good reason for it. And it also talks about establishing a new constitutional commission to address some of the way that fiscal arrangements work, moving money between Scotland and the United Kingdom and back again, that I think are really important if we're serious about rising to some of the big public policy challenges.
Well, there's a challenge for a question on that, and Kezia can expound at great length. Christina Patterson is with us, journalist and broadcaster, and Liam Halligan, economist and broadcaster. We're all broadcasters here, aren't we? Right, let's go to a follow-up WhatsApp question from Steve in Manchester. Would a Trump administration solve the Middle East crisis? Well, Liam, you and I used to co-present a programme called CNN Talk, where virtually every
Remarkably, we didn't kill each other.
No, we didn't. And sadly, it came to an end after 2 years. But and that was in the middle of the Trump administration, wasn't it? And I remember you and I would often say, well, look, he does have actually some successes in his foreign policy. And this narrative that he was just mad in foreign policy terms doesn't really stand up to scrutiny, does it?
Well, certainly not in terms of the Middle East. One of his big achievements in the Middle East, which isn't remarked upon nearly enough in my view, are the Abraham Accords, which have led to a real wonderful blossoming of business between Israeli entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs from elsewhere across the Middle East, not least in the UAE, but elsewhere as well. And history shows that the more countries trade, the more countries do business, the less likely they are to go to war and to engage in violence. And that may sound naive, but that does hold over many decades across many countries. I don't think he gets enough credit for that. We always discussed, didn't we, Iain, when Donald Trump came up on our CNN talk show, he's very bombastic. He calls, North Korean leaders little rocket man and so on. He seems to deliberately seek to provoke, but he gets foreign affairs in the headlines. And, he's one of the few American presidents of recent years that hasn't taken the country to war. Some people would say that's a coincidence. I think when it comes to both Ukraine and the Middle East, there's a sense that until there is a change in the White House, to go back to Christina's original point, that not much is going to happen in either of those two theatres until the Americans decide who's going to be in charge for the next 4 years. I think certainly, to go back, when it comes to the Middle East, we haven't got the luxury of waiting until next January before the international community gets seriously involved.
Christina?
Well, I do think it would be pretty disastrous for the world if Trump gets in, but also looking relatively likely that he might. I think it would be really disastrous for Ukraine if he gets in, because he has shown that he has absolutely no interest in defending Ukraine, and he would certainly encourage Putin and, encourage Zelensky to give up the land that Putin has already taken. And in terms of Europe's stability and security and safety, I think that would be an absolute disaster. In terms of the Middle East, who knows what thought would pop into his head if he became president. I do agree about the Abraham Accords, and I think, one of the tragic things about this latest war is that the chink of light was that they were looking to recognise Israel for the first time, and it looked as if there might be pressure from UAE and Saudi Arabia to recognise Israel, and therefore for some kind of different arrangement in Gaza. But it looks for the moment as if that ship has sailed, and understandably other Arab countries in the region, looking at what has happened in Gaza, are in no mood to recognise the state of Israel. So we have, as we seem to all the time, stalemate. I think
say that, but actually, if you look at the reaction from many countries, Saudi Arabia, for example, has not gone tonto.
No, not Saudi Arabia or UAE,
and even some of the other countries have remained relatively silent, whereas you might have expected some pretty volcanic reactions. Obviously, Iran is the exception.
Well, to be honest, my only hope through this whole awful period has been that with those countries, because obviously with encouragement from the US, because without that I can't see. I mean, Israel is just constantly going to be threatened with annihilation, and this situation is going to go on forever.
Daniel in Tel Aviv has sent us a WhatsApp message. He says, I'm a British Israeli in Tel Aviv. Generally, most people in the country, both on the right and left, are for a ground invasion. The citizens are sick of hundreds of rockets targeting the north every week and are generally pro-tough military action. Greg, on the Trump point.
Well, I think it's hard to see. I think the question was actually, will Trump solve the Middle East crisis? And I think it's hard to see after 80 years that suddenly anybody is going to come along and find a solution within 4 years. So I think the answer to the question will be no. What would Trump's position be? And I agree with Christina, I think much more concerning is his position on Ukraine. And arguably in the Middle East, I think he does, correct if I'm wrong, from memory, have quite a good relationship with Netanyahu, which could potentially be put to good use, because I'm not sure that Joe Biden has got such a good relationship. So, I mean, I would say that there's some potential there for that relationship. I think the other thing we don't know is who Trump might appoint as Secretary of State. Which is a big sort of unknown, which I think when you look at the role that Tony Blinken has played, he's been, I think, in the region now 9 times so far.
But to what effect?
Well, I think, first of all, how will Trump appoint somebody good and quickly? Because you remember last time he went through 2 or 3 secretaries of state before he eventually hit on Mike Pompeo, it's a couple of years later. So it could end up being that the Trump sort of diplomacy effort might be a little bit chaotic. So in which case, I don't think his chance of solving anything will be that high if he doesn't have a good, capable person in very quickly a secretary.
It's quite an interesting point, because his unpredictability could be seen as a huge weakness in foreign policy, but he managed to somehow turn it into a strength in his first term. I wonder how that would transpire in a second term. And like you, Christina, I don't want him to win, but the little devil journalist on my shoulder thinks it'd be very interesting to watch.
I'm sick of that show. I got sick of the Boris show and I'm sick of the Trump show. I don't want to see either of them ever again.
I think the difference between a second Trump presidency will be that this could be the Trump unchained version of him. He could be even bolder, more erratic, and cause more damage than he did first time around, because he knows how to get his way around the Oval Office now, and he knows how he would intend to do things differently. I agree with Christina. I'm far more concerned about the situation in Ukraine. We know that Putin's long-term plan has been that support would fall in the West. We know that Americans don't quite understand why they're funding this war, and we know that will change if Trump wins. So I think that should concern us greatly.
Right, let's take another question. This is a text question from Ollie in Portsmouth. Is the government talking the country down? Now, the Prime Minister has denied this evening that he's doing this, while NHS bosses have also said that the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting's repeated claims that the NHS is broken is significantly hurting staff morale. He says he won't back down in highlighting the problems facing the service. Greg Hans.
Well, I'm going to try and not be partisan here. As you rightly said, introducing myself as the former chairman of the Conservative Party. In fact,
you don't get much more partisan than that job, do you?
I would say a couple of things. First of all, I think, Ian, you and I would probably recognise there's been a trend in the last perhaps 20 years. 30 years ago, somebody like Norman Lamont or John Major would never do something like, say, the economy is in a really bad position, or these tough challenges that we're facing. You would always try to talk things up, and I think
green shoots
a trend. Well, actually, you might, yeah. I mean, but I think it was regarded as being very unorthodox to sort of say things look grim economically 30 years ago, and that's, I think, across different parties. I think David and George did that in 2010. I think. Definitely as Starmer and Reeves are doing that now. That's the first thing I would say. So in terms of talking down Britain, I don't think it's necessarily been something this week. I think it's been something that's actually been going on for perhaps the last 10, 15 years. I think people see a sort of political advantage and sort of saying things are awful, but by the way, they'll get better if you stick with me and there's light at the end of the tunnel. That has been a trend. Second thing I would say, having said that, though, is I can't remember in my political lifetime a government getting off to such a sort of a bad start. And I don't mean in terms of the situation they've inherited
but
or
you wouldn't
economic
want to be
data.
partisan.
Well, I'm trying to be objective, and I've just never seen, I think, so many sort of unforced errors so quickly in the term of a government. You know, if you think back to...
Where were you for Liz Truss?
Well, no, I'm actually talking about... But Liz Truss, don't forget, was 10 years, 12 years into the government. Here you're talking about a big mandate having been won on the 4th of July, and having got off to such a bad start. I just cannot remember. And I don't think even Harold Wilson got into that sort of bad a start, or Ted Heath in 1970. I just think they made a real hash of it so far. Now, obviously, it's still very early days. We're only 2 and 10
I thought they handled the riots rather well.
Well, I'm not sure. Well, look, I'm not sure. I didn't watch the riot. I mean, I was actually out of the country during the riot, so I'm not necessarily best placed to say how that was handled. It did seem to take a long time to have the reaction, the sensible reaction, to basically try and clamp down and send in the forces of law and order. I'm just saying, having seen various governments in my lifetime and been part of governments, and I'm not saying that will necessarily last. I'm not saying necessarily that that's a precursor to the next general election, but I just can't remember a government off to such a bad and unforced error-strewn start as this one.
All right, Kezia, it is unusual for a Prime Minister to just be constantly full of gloom and doom, isn't it? I mean, and up until his speech yesterday, that has been Keir Starmer and indeed Rachel Reeves' mantra, that they had this terrible economic inheritance, despite the fact that inflation is where it should be, unemployment's on the way down, growth is better than most other countries. I mean, it wasn't all a terrible inheritance, and yet he sort of hyped this up in a way that I think has caused economic damage. I mean, Liam knows better than I do, but I'm sure I know several businesses that have put off investment decisions because of this rhetoric.
So I think it's very hard to bring doom and gloom into a party conference. You're just not going to get the claps at that. So that, I think, explains the mood change. That said, I get asked a lot about, why isn't this like 97? It should feel like 97 again with the size of the majority and all the rest of it. And I think we're in very, very different economic times. We're very different cultural times in a number of different ways. And I think what Keir Starmer is trying to do is to speak to the mood of the nation, which is actually pretty bleak. And the 2 examples I would give to you is that trust in politics, the political process, has never been as low as it is at the moment since records began. We don't like our politicians. We don't trust them. We think they're all at it. We've got a really big challenge there.
And they've proved over the last few weeks that they are all at it. That's the problem, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I don't personally think that is the scandal that some people want to present it as. It is very definitely suboptimal, and I think they would prefer a whole heap of different circumstances going into their first party conference in government. But I think Keir Starmer is trying to speak to an economic mood which is pretty bleak. It's how people feel. It doesn't matter what those top line economic numbers are. People feel like the last decade or so has been incredibly hard. They do need a bit of that light. They need a bit of that kind of hopey, changey thing, without question. I've just got a funny feeling we might get a bit more of that than we're expecting in the budget. What I would say about the NHS, though, is that I'm full square behind Wes Streeting. The NHS is broken. It's been broken for a very long time, actually. Some of that is the Tories' fault, and I'm happy to go into the detail of that. But the reality of it is also that this is a national health service that was born out of the Second World War, that was designed to deal with older people living perhaps 3 or 4 well years after they stopped work and not living into their 80s and 90s as they do now. Now people can expect to live for 25, 30 years after they retire, and our systems are not designed for that.
Okay. Liam?
Well, various surveys of consumer sentiment, business sentiment show that I would say the national mood has been hit with economic consequences. The GfK Consumer Survey plunged in July. The IOD Institute Director Survey showed investment, to your point, Iain, falling at its sharpest rate in the UK than since the beginning of lockdown, the COVID-related lockdown. So I do think there's a a sense that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have overdone it when it comes to gloom, because of course they've wanted to promote this narrative that they face a £22 billion black hole, a black hole which even the Institute of Fiscal Studies has said, and I quote, was obvious to anyone who dared look. Look, I think the reason the likes of Norman Lamont back in the 70s and 80s were always careful about talking the economy up, or at least avoiding talking the economy down, is because that was just a few years after the turmoil of the mid-70s, when Britain went cap in hand to the IMF, when the gnomes of Zurich, as we used to call them back then, i.e. the gilts market, rebelled and Britain needed to be bailed out. It was our economic Suez. And I'm not trying to talk the economy down myself. I try and be very responsible in terms of what I write. But financial markets, debt markets are very skittish. It is a decent economic inheritance in some senses for Labour, but on the other hand, the national debt is 100% of GDP. That's not Labour's fault. That's all our fault as a political and media class for not focusing more on that. So that is difficult. There's a tsunami of government borrowing coming down the track. And we need to be very careful about talking down the economy, as I think the Labour leadership has, as part of a political blame-shifting parlour game. These are very important issues. The government of the day cannot be seen to be bad-mouthing the fiscal position for party political gain, because the sense of where Britain is fiscally is an extremely important aspect of our national life that we need to protect, because when gilt markets rebel, everyone will know about it. And those of us, who lived through the 70s, remember that period, it seems like every new generation of politicians has to learn again, the realities of financial markets and mathematics. You've got to be very careful when you're in these high offices of talking down the economy. It can have really bad fiscal implications.
Christina, I'm going to ask you to be a little brief.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, it's not good. I think a lot of it is tone, actually. I think, very sadly, because I think he's, a decent man trying to do a good job, I think Keir Starmer is not good at tone. And if we look back at David Cameron and George Osborne and, the meal they made out of the so-called economic mess that Labour left behind, when in fact there had been a global economic crisis, David Cameron was a cheery guy. He was a natural optimist, and he was, I was no great fan of his, but he was very good at tone. He was an excellent communicator. I think, sadly, Keir Starmer is not a good communicator, and he really struggles with tone. So I think they have managed to plunge everybody into despair, and I think that's unfortunate, because there is just not a scintilla of 1997, and I wish there was.
OK, thank you very much indeed. We'll come to more of your questions in just a moment here on Cross Question. It's 8:34. News headlines on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
Israel's military is preparing for a possible ground operation in Lebanon, according to the chief of the Israeli army. Earlier, it said it's activating reserve troops in response to rising tensions with Hezbollah. The government has revealed dozens of inmates were wrongly released as part of measures to ease overcrowding in prisons. The Ministry of Justice says most have now been returned, and it's working with police to recall 5 more offenders. And rail workers have voted by huge margins to accept new pay deals. The RMT union says it means a long-running national dispute is over. LBC weather: a band of rain moving northwards into central areas tonight. Showers for the south and a low of -1.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's not the winter fuel.
8:36 on LBC. We have Greg Hands, Kezia Dugdale, Liam Halligan and Christina Patterson with us answering your questions. Here's a text question from Harry, which we won't spend too much time on because we've talked about it a lot on the programme, but it says, is this scandal around the PM accepting free stuff just a storm in a teacup, as this kind of thing has happened since the dawn of time? Christina.
Well, I did the Sky News on Saturday, the press preview, and I said something not dissimilar and instantly lost hundreds of followers.
Did you?
So, yes. I do think it is a storm in a teacup. It was within the rules. I
just feel those followers trickling away.
I'll have none left by the end of this conversation. For example, the so-called £10,000 for accommodation. Look, if someone offers you £20,000, sorry. If someone, clearly it's an amazing flat, but if someone offers you a place where your son can revise for his GCSEs because you are being barricaded by journalists every day, I do not think it is a killing offence to accept that. I don't think money was exchanged. I think that had to be declared at the cost of this, incredibly rich man's very posh apartment. And so once you put a figure on it, it looks awful. I don't think it is awful. In terms of clothes for Keir Starmer's wife, I think fair enough. She's not earning an enormous amount, and she is the wife of a world leader.
They earn £220,000 between them.
I think it was really unwise. I don't think Keir Starmer should have accepted the ridiculous glasses or the suits. I have more sympathy for the women because they are very harshly judged in the media by what they wear, and I think you do need a nice frock or two for when you arrive at Downing Street. And I think if someone offers that to you, in hindsight, I don't think she should have accepted. But if someone offers it to you and is not actively trying to wield influence because they're already a lord, I don't think it's a hanging offence. What I do think is that all of this was a mistake. I think that they've handled it in communications terms really badly, and I think it's a terrible shame because it ran for a week. It's completely overshadowed the conference, and I think if you say I'm coming here for public service and I want to clean out the rot, and then you are doing stuff that people with an average salary of 30 grand think looks, and you're earning 200 grand, looks ridiculous, I think that was really unwise.
And I think it has had a bit of cut through with the general public.
Yeah.
And I know I was in the hotel lift on Monday and Angela Rayner got in. And she said, glad you got over your sepsis. I said, it wasn't sepsis. I had a gallbladder. It was very different. And, of course, my instant reaction was to think, nice suit. Yeah. Great.
Well, look, I think on the face of it, what's actually happened in terms of the offence, in inverted commas, you're right, is not necessarily particularly serious. I think the two things that exacerbated, though, was Starmer's whole tone and the tone of Labour in recent years about Conservatives getting into this kind of trouble, and Starmer painting himself often as a sort of a whiter than white, rules-based person, a very sort of legal kind of following the rules at all times.
Well, to be fair, no rules have been broken here. He did declare it all.
But it's the kind of it has been declared, but it's also the kind of the tone of this is something which ought to have come out earlier, and I think it should have been explained. And I think that the whole way that some of it has been said, well, of course, the defence has been, of course, the Prime Minister's wife needs to dress well, which kind of avoids the issue. The issue here at question is there influence here being bought by somebody by making donations? That is why we have to register donations. As a member of Parliament for 19 years, I had to register everything over a limit of, I think it's about something like £170, and people can then judge, whether somebody has given that thing in return for getting some kind of favour or some kind of influence. That's why we have those registers. So I think it's the hypocrisy on the one hand, and secondly, the attempt to sort of throw up a kind of a defence that, of course, people need to dress well in those jobs. We all would agree with that. But that doesn't mean to say that you have to accept a donation of clothing. As you rightly point out, these are well-salaried people. These people ought to be able to afford their own business clothing, not have to depend on a donation.
Is there a difference between Margaret Thatcher, for instance, accepting loans from Aquascutum, of those massive shoulder pad suits that she used to wear. I mean, she never owned them, but Aquascutum would let her sort of go and choose some to wear. Then they would go back. I mean, is there a difference there, or Aquascutum were just doing it out of the generosity of their own hearts?
Well, I would look. I'm not familiar with Margaret Thatcher's wardrobe in the 80s, but I would imagine Aquascutum were doing it for sort of some free advertising. I'm not sure Lord Arley was doing it for free advertising. Let's put it that way.
No.
I'm not entirely sure what his motive was.
He wanted Labour to win. He's always wanted Labour to win. He's a sitting Labour peer. He's part of the team around the leadership.
But he does
for a
have
long
business
time.
interests, doesn't he? Which I mean, are not insignificant.
And we all know that, and they're all registered, and you can read them on the House of Lords website. I have met Wahid Ali before. In fact, I saw a lot of him during the 2015 general election campaign because he did a world of good to try and support Ed Miliband at the time. I've been in one of his houses, which he lent to us to help Ed Miliband prepare for TV debates. All he's ever wanted is Labour to win elections and for him to do well. This is not a scandal. This is a guy who's already in the House of Lords and doesn't need a parliamentary pass out of some dirty deal that we're all trying to hint at here. This is a guy that wants Labour to win, and turns out he's played a pretty big part in that.
Okay, Liam.
There is not to pick at hairs, but there's a big difference between a parliamentary pass, which, frankly, any old journalist can get hold of, and a pass to 10 Downing Street. Look, I'll be brief, Ian. I think gift-taking by politicians, however innocuous, however friends-related, is a slippery slope. I think our rules should be even stricter than they are. And for an incoming Labour government to get caught like this in the middle of a cost of living crisis, I just think it's a bit politically tin-eared and lacking in strategy.
But we can agree it's not a PPE scandal. We can agree it's not Greensill. We can agree there's a difference in scale.
Of course there's a difference in scale, but we're now in a situation where an awful lot of people are suffering, they're scared about their financial future, and it's just not a great look for incoming ministers of the first Labour government in 14 years to be seen by the public to be taking expensive clothes that they can only dream of at a time like this, when there's a lot of economic fear out there.
It's Sarah Jones, who she's in the business department, I think one of the most impressive ministers of state. But she was asked on a programme last week about the fact that, I think Victoria Derbyshire on Newsnight asked her, that she wasn't expecting the question, how can you defend taking tickets to a Taylor Swift conference and taking your daughters? And her only response was, well, it was fun. And I mean, I'm not trying to be a killjoy here, but you have to have a better explanation than that, don't you?
I think you also have to be incredibly careful as a politician. I mean, I was MP for both Chelsea and Fulham football clubs, and I would occasionally go to matches, normally not very often. I'd almost always avoid the owner of the two clubs. It turns out with very, very good reason, those two owners. But my point is you've got to use your own judgment. You've got to, how would this look? And there's no free lunch. Somebody is looking to get something out of you if they're giving you something.
Is that really the case? I mean, how can you sit there with a straight face and say that as former Conservative Party chairman, where your mantra as chairman is, well, people make donations because they're being philanthropic. They're not giving us £5 million because they want to change a policy on something. That's what you would have said as party chairman.
Well, I would have said as party chairman that people were giving their money because, like Kezia was saying, in terms of wanting Labour to win, these are people who wanted the Conservatives to win, not necessarily people who, if you wanted to get a specific policy change or a specific influence, then you might give or try to give something to an individual rather than to the political party, I believe. But I think it just shows you just have to be extremely careful. We've got the rules in place for a very, very good reason, that you can be transparent, you make your declarations, and you allow people to make up their own minds based on that declaration of what is actually going on.
And the fact of the matter is, unless you have state funding of political parties, the only other alternative is to have private donations. And as you say, as long as they're transparent, in theory, there shouldn't be anything wrong. Harry, thank you for that. We'll come on to more questions and, of course, our fun question for the end of the programme, which everybody really enjoys, don't they, panel? It's 8:46.
This is LBC. Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
It's 8:49. Well, the breaking news is that Kemi Badenoch is in the building, and she will be sitting down with me in the studio in 11 minutes' time. And if you'd like to put a question to her about her views, her Conservative views, how she would lead the Conservative Party, it's your chance between 9 and 10. But we are still in the company now of Greg Hans, Kezia Dugdale, Liam Halligan and Christina Patterson. Luke's in Orpington. Hello, Luke.
Hello. Listening to that last question, I think you could summarise it as the Emperor's new clothes. What do you think?
Well, you could, but I know that's not your real question.
No, it's not good. My question is the housing problems that we have in this country. What was the cause, and how can we solve it in this next government?
Well, let's talk to the author of Home Truths, a book on housing policy, Liam Halligan.
The UK's chronic housing shortage, why it matters and how to solve it. Crikey, a huge question, a very important question. Today's generation of 25 to 34-year-olds are less likely to own a home and are paying more of their income in accommodation costs than any generation since the 1930s. That's the situation we're in. There's a huge increase in the number of young adults living with their parents still into their 20s and 30s, and this is now messing with our demography. People are having fewer children than they want, or even delaying families or not having families completely because of our housing issue. Many reasons. It's a chronic shortage of supply in the face of ever-growing demand. Our house building industry doesn't build enough houses, and the state hasn't been building many houses and housing associations since the mid-1980s. So there is a chronic shortage. I do think there are things that can be done. I think the state can use its own land and make that available for house building, earmarking plots for small and medium-sized builders who build out quickly, Iain, to get more homes built. I think that could be done quite quickly. I also think there should be a revolution in the provision of social housing in this country. The fact that we have not nearly enough social homes, council housing and housing association homes, means that our housing benefit bill, where people who can't afford a home of their own to buy or to rent, their rent is paid by the state, that's now about £25 billion. It's absolutely huge. That money should be going into building houses that can act as social homes instead. The green belt, I think, is an issue. I'm not talking about areas of outstanding natural beauty, national parks, or even parts of the green belt, much of which is of aesthetic and recreational value, but much of the green belt isn't. Much of the green belt is urban scrub or railway sidings, and the green belt is getting bigger and bigger. It covers 13% of the land mass of this country, and residential housing plus gardens covers less than 2%. The green belt is more than twice the size in acreage as it was in the late 1970s because it keeps getting added to. So where we've built new stations, that should be available for housing. In parts of the Greenbelt where it's suitable for development, that should now happen. My general thought about Labour's approach so far, I'm extremely glad they're focusing on house building. I've spoken to many frontbenchers about house building. Some of them have even read and talked to me at length about Home Truths. In general, I've written about this in recent months in my Telegraph column, but in general, I think Labour's approach is too heavy-handed in the sense they're just completely going to remove much of local consultation. I think that will end in a tsunami of lawsuits. And similarly, with their plans to use more compulsory purchase orders to make agricultural land available for residential house building. I don't think that legalistic way is the way to go. We've got to find other ways to free up land, and I think a quick early win could be to release state land. The state owns 6% of all freehold, and make some of that available for a house building boom that could be a really important part of getting the UK economy back on track.
Kezia.
I agree with all of that. I should say I sit on the board of Shelter. I chair Shelter Scotland. It's why I'm in London today. It's the meeting I've just come from. I am pleased, and perhaps I would say that with my background in the Labour Party, that we do now have a government that believes in and has people in it who grew up in social housing. What a difference that will make. Actually, and I'm sorry to do this like handbrake turn, but there's a lot about housing in this paper I've written and published today. I know, see what I did there? Not least because yesterday the housing stats came out in Scotland, and we have hit the highest ever recorded level of children in temporary accommodation, 10,110. Wow. It's risen for every year for the last 10 years. It's an absolute disgrace. It's a complete emergency.
Is that the same in England?
I wouldn't like to say. I couldn't tell you the figure off the top of my head. These are the figures I saw yesterday in Scotland. They're really bad. The answer, part of the answer at least, is to build social housing. But let me tell you, there's not a huge incentive for the Scottish Government to build social housing when the benefit of that in fiscal terms is felt by the Treasury. I would like to see a situation, this is what we argue for in this paper, that the Scottish Government was to use capital money to build more social housing in Scotland and therefore save the Treasury money because fewer people would be paying housing benefit in the private renter sector and would be doing it in social housing instead, that the Scottish Government could keep a bit of that money, if not all of that money, and reinvest it in more housing. That currently can't happen under the fiscal arrangements. I'd like to see it happen, and that's the type of public policy focused argument we're putting forward in the paper today.
Christina.
Goodness, there's so much. I mean, all of that. And I was on the board of a housing association as well. I mean, some of this stuff feels quite very difficult because, for example, some housing, not the housing association I was on, but some housing associations have to finance their social housing by building private housing, and some of that gets instantly sold to Chinese owners who don't even live in them. So I do think there are...
George Osborne passed a law that meant that couldn't happen.
Did he?
Maybe I've imagined that.
They have to pay higher stamp duty. It can happen.
Yeah, they can. It does happen. And I do think that, I mean, I'm no expert. I don't, in terms of what you can do in terms of legislation.
That's the second time you said that this evening.
Well, I feel, I mean, I know it's unusual for someone to acknowledge they're not an expert in absolutely everything, but I feel it's only fair. I mean, mass house building has to be the answer. And I'm afraid, although, of course, there probably will be lawsuits and there will be unhappiness, but if you want to do things quickly, I'm afraid there will, you have to. You can't let, if you have process of consultation, everybody will say no to anything in their backyard. Of course they will. So I think it's one of the things that Labour has acted on very quickly, and I really hope they succeed.
Just briefly, if I may, there are hundreds of thousands of planning permissions outstanding that the big house builders aren't using in order to drip feed local markets to keep prices high. And also, I agree with your sentiment, but there's a legal brick wall out there. You can't just keep running into it, and we need more housing quickly, and so that's why I would make sure that planning permissions that have been granted but aren't being used, so-called ghost houses, and Shelter's done great work exposing this. 45% of planning permissions given in London aren't used. So push the big house builders to use those planning permissions, fine them if they don't, and also use state land for residential house building, which can be turned around very, very quickly in order to get housing supply moving. That's the only way we're going to get more affordable housing.
OK. Greg?
I would just add something to Liam's point about public sector land, because when I was Chief Secretary of the Treasury, this is something that I worked on. Unfortunately, I wasn't doing that job for more than about 15 months, but Oliver Letwin, who was a very, very effective government minister in these kind of places, to release public sector land. And actually, it shouldn't be that difficult, but it is quite difficult. I mean, for example, TfL, to give one example, TfL have got a land estate in London bigger than the London Borough of Camden. Now, obviously, a lot of those stations and tracks and bus stops and whatever else. But nonetheless, the potential there...
Stop banging the table.
Sorry. The potential there... the NHS has got a huge estate. And obviously not much of that estate has actually got hospitals and clinical facilities on. And the key to unlocking it is to incentivise other parts of the public sector, which it's not one of their performance targets. If you're running the NHS, releasing land is not even in your top 50 of targets. If you're running Transport for London, releasing land. So you've got to, from the top down, make sure that that is one of the key targets for all of your public sector, is to release land. We made some progress, and actually the last government overall did not have a bad record on house building. It could have been better, particularly if the public sector land aspect had really been much more disciplined and rigorous, making sure that all parts of the public sector are properly incentivised to release that land.
Right, let's move on to our fun question from Cecily in Gerrard's Cross. The Post Office Horizon campaigner Sir Alan Bates got his knighthood at Windsor Castle today from Princess Anne. Who else deserves a gong, in your view, and why? Apart from everyone sitting around this table, excluding me. Christina?
Well, it's not what he wants, because what he wants is something else which he's not getting. But I would give a gong to Zelensky, because I think how he has responded to the nightmare he has found himself in, and the way he continues day after day to fly around the world to lobby leaders for what they don't want to give in order to protect freedom and democracy in his country, I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
You can give knighthoods to foreign nationals, can't you? Bob Geldof.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's do it. I mean, it's the last thing he wants, but, let's do it.
Liam?
Well, two of my childhood heroes were Daley Thompson and Sharon Davis. And Daley Thompson, who won 2 Olympic golds, was one of the greatest athletes of British history, and of course in my childhood was a huge positive role model, and he was always brilliant on Superstars as well. Remember that, taking on Brian Jackson.
Has
Brian
he not got anything?
No, he's got a CBE, but he hasn't got a knighthood. But why hasn't Daley Thompson got a knighthood? He won 2 Olympic golds and was a trailblazer. He was undefeated for 9 years. What an incredible athlete! And at the same time, Sharon Davis, she's got an MBE, fully deserved. She missed out on that gold in Moscow because her opponents were drugged. And I think she's done a fantastic job in recent years speaking out in terms of gender politics, putting her head above the parapet and standing up for women in sports, particularly elite sport.
Can you imagine the controversy if she was given a damehood? I hear what you say. Greg?
I would choose somebody, quite often these people get CBEs or OBEs, but I would choose a sort of unsung hero who may not be so well known, but it sends an important message about something that person is doing. So I would choose somebody like, say, in my constituency, or my former constituency, the guy who the last 40 years has been running a place called the Brunswick Club, which provides youth facilities, football training, boxing, chess, and he's a very quiet, unassuming guy, and he's been doing it for 40 years. He's going to be very embarrassed if he's listening. Danny Volino. Nobody will have heard of him, but it sends a message, a bit like how OBs and CBs can work, that a great sort of unsung hero with an amazing story.
I have to move you on because we're eating into Kemi time. Kezia.
So I'm going to go for the social housing campaigner Quadjo, if you follow him on Twitter.
Oh, we've interviewed Quadjo on the programme. Quadjo, actually.
Quadjo, apologies.
Many times.
When you only follow somebody on Twitter, you never quite know how to pronounce things.
He's a character.
He's doing so much to make the arguments we're making tonight real.
Right, thank you for those answers, and thank you for coming on the programme tonight. Monday's panel, which will be live from the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham, former Tory Special Advisor Tom Skinner. We have the pollster, Scarlett Maguire, and we will have a Conservative MP, but we don't know which one of the 121 is going to be the lucky one on Monday. Coming up in the next hour, I'm going to be joined by Conservative leadership contender Kemi Badenoch. She's the Shadow Housing Secretary, of course was Business Secretary in the last government. So she's one of the last 4. Will she get down to the last 2? Well, Conservative MPs will be voting on that when Parliament returns in a couple of weeks' time. But of course, each of the 4 have got to advertise their wares to the Conservative Party conference and Conservative Party members next week. So Kemi will be here for the next hour. I'll be interviewing her for the first 20-25 minutes, and then we'll go to your questions. So if you have a question for Kemi Badenoch, the number to call 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global